To be speaking with you today. I've participated in many of the seminars that happened over the year with the SRI Institute, and I've just been flabbergasted, amazed at the amazing groups of scholars that have come and presented. So I'm really, as I said, excited and intimidated. I'll explain this title a little bit later in the talk, but I want to sort of explain what it is actually trying to say. It's actually not and human. It's actually supposed to be greater than and less than human. And really the talk that what I want to sort of explore with you a little bit here today is the idea of humanness as a sort of primary criteria for evaluating the success or failure of things like computational agents, specifically ones focused on behavioral intervention in healthcare. And I want to sort of put out some alternative starting points for thinking about how we might develop those kinds of technologies. The project that I'm going to be sort of using as my object of analysis is this natural language conversational agent, basically being developed to address smoking addiction by a very multidisciplinary team of people here at University of Toronto and at CAMH. And the goal of that agent is really to be capable of free form interaction and to sort of mimic types of interaction that are typically used currently in human to human therapy. And this very pragmatic goal to actually provide the automated delivery of a current established and successful clinical therapy, basically one called motivational interviewing, which I'll describe here in a minute. The team, of which I am a very minor member, you see on the screen in front of you, includes a number of faculty and students. You can see a bunch of them listed there. It's really led by Professor Jonathan Rose in electrical and computer engineering. Many of you probably know Jonathan, and Dr. Peter Selby, who is the chief of medicine in psychiatry, a clinical scientist at CAMH, and a professor here at U of T as well. It involves a number of students, some of which are no longer working on the project, but have worked on the project extensively over the last few years. And I'll mention just as a kind of a call out, the bottom three students, Matt Iatorno, Olivia Doggett, and Camille Inson, who are the students from the Faculty of Information, from the Faculty of Information that are working directly with me on this project. I also have to sort of preface these statements by noting that really what I'm going to be sharing with you here today are sort of observations and starting points and questions rather than anything that is more sort of fully fleshed out. Again, the starting point for me is really this idea of humanness as a criteria for evaluating bots. And that title, again, that greater than and less than, is sort of my way of starting to think a little bit about cultural perceptions on sort of what we might call thinking machines. And you see a couple of them up here on the screen in front of you right now. On one hand, we've got Roy Batty from Blade Runner, this replicant who really in the story is sort of more than human, has these incredible capabilities that extend beyond human capabilities. And that's sort of part of the plot line of that movie. And on the other hand, we've got C3PO and R2D2 who are human-like, but in a sense less than human. C3PO is sort of awkward and has a lot of sort of physical and emotional issues, cowardly, things like that. R2D2, on the other hand, is almost animalistic, very emotive, but doesn't even speak human language. So these, we're sort of, the interesting thing about this though really is that we are used to evaluating these kinds of thinking machines with a reference to the human. And that's really the sort of starting point for my talk here today. My particular sort of role and interest in this smoking cessation project is from within the kind of area of human-computer interaction and technoscience. And my work generally, and my work on this project specifically, starts from this sort of idea that we need to reach beyond the great divide between, on one hand, engineering and on the other hand, humanistic traditions and social sciences. And this work, this quote you see up on your screen, I think highlights actually how long, in fact, even before this, but certainly how long we've been concerned about the ways in which computational technologies have people problems and need a multidisciplinary approach. Um, I'm going to signal a little bit here too that my home discipline is really science and technology studies. That's where the technoscience comes from, and specifically my work on this project, and again, what I'm going to speak to you about, really comes from this idea that there's value in a deeper engagement with ideas and concepts related to technoscience, and in particular, the idea of the post-human that's been developed by feminist scholars such as Donna Haraway, Sandra Harding, and Rosie Braidotti, who I'll be referencing extensively at the end. So my goal really here is not just to talk about those guys, but to actually think a little bit about how they might help us think about and design new constellations of non-human cognitive agents. And so I'm, again, starting points, but that's where I'm going to try to head. My talk breaks down into these three different sections. On one hand, I'm going to talk a little bit about this object of analysis and work, the smoking cessation bot. I'm going to try to give you some details about that. Then I want to turn just again very briefly to this idea of humanness and how we've tended to evaluate human-like behavior in the past. That's a very quick look at that. I'm sure people on this call have much more sophisticated understanding of that. And then I'll turn again, as I just said, to the end, thinking a little bit more about this idea of the post-human and some of the design implications that we might leverage from that. So the bot. Well, so this bot that we're working on is basically a natural language conversational agent intended to deploy a form of counseling. It sits in context with a number of other technologies and bots and conversational agents that are currently in the marketplace that are being leveraged for clinical and counseling goals. You see a few of them up here on the screen: WISA, Wobot, Smoke-Free App, but there are many, many, many of these kinds of systems that are currently being developed and being deployed. In fact, to the extent of which that some of these systems are actually being licensed by the FDA as Class 2 medical interventions, and therefore are actually in the now and in the immediate future going to be considered almost the same as pharmaceuticals, so that they would actually be prescribed as a medical intervention in similar ways. So a lot of attention on this area, a lot of work going on. The specific bot that we're working on is intended to deploy a particular form of counseling, a form of counseling that's been proven to work really well with addiction in particular. That involves these various aspects, that involves the development of empathy, has to do with a very client-centered approach to help the client discover discrepancy between their goals and their behavior. It's not argumentative, and it adjusts to client resistance rather than opposing it, and is focused on the development of self-efficacy and optimism. To be clear though, and this is both sort of an interesting aspect of the bot that is being developed and MI, and a bit of a problem as well, is that MI as a field has actually been sort of struggled a little bit with how to think of itself either programmatically as a sort of a procedure, or going beyond that to think of it as a sort of a complex clinical communication methodology. Because of this, actually, there have been a number of bots. I'll show you some later. I'll give you a sense of some later that have been developed that are trying to be developed around motivational interviewing, but they all sort of struggle with some of these particular aspects that you see up here on the screen. And this is sort of the spur for some of the work that's being done around this project. To give you a sense of that bot that I'm just describing, some of them, at least one, has actually been built within the project. It was built a few years ago and was the topic of this gentleman. You see the citation up at the top of the screen, his master's thesis here at U of T. And it has, it sort of looks like this. So you can see a basic transcript, the first part of a transcript from this previous version of the bot. Basically, it asks some questions, the subject responds, and it tries to react to those responses. To give you a little bit more sense of what that looks like, not quite at the technical level, but at a little bit more of a technical level, this is how that bot actually worked. This is actually how many of the bots that I've been talking about actually operate. Um, the bot asks a question, pulls a question from a list, and basically sends that initial question to the user. The user then responds with some type of response, which then goes to a part of the bot that uses a natural language processing classifier, a pre-trained program. And this is basically a program that has been previously fed matched pairs of text phrases and predetermined classifications so that it can automatically recognize and categorize new text input. And in this case, what you see is the user is saying something to do with my hands. The NLP classifier looks at that and says, this falls into the category of text phrases having something in my hand. And then based on being able to classify it, it knows how to select from a pre-programmed set of responses the response of, oh, just the act of holding a cigarette is what you enjoy. So in this version of the conversational agent, the conversational agent is not generating text, but is in fact attempting to recognize what the user is saying and then sets out a set of pre-programmed responses. And within the concept of motivational interviewing, by the way, this is actually not a bad thing, in the sense that the goal of the bot, among others, is to basically instantiate a version of sort of reflective listening. So there's a way in which that act of responding, even though it's sort of pre-programmed, accomplishes that goal. Now, what's actually super interesting and sort of where this bot is going, and again, this has not been built yet, but is in process, is a bot system that instead of just classifying text, actually generates text itself. And this is using systems, natural language processing systems like GPT-2 and GPT-3. Some of you have probably heard a lot about GPT-3 and the ways in which it can sort of generate text from text inputs. In this version, this future version of the bot, again, a question is posed to the user. The user responds with some kind of answer. That answer is fed into a pre-trained system like GPT-3 and is primed to create multiple possible responses based on that training. And we know, as we know, that training is basically billions and billions and billions of words and phrases that have been put into that text generator. In the case of this sort of planned bot that we're talking about a little bit, that is not fed directly back to the user, but instead is tested by yet another classifier, which has been pre-trained to recognize when a reflection is adequate. And then if the one or more of the responses passes the quality check, the response is then sent back to the user. So currently the team is actually working on a reflecto bot. That's a term that's been coming up and making great progress on both the use of GPT-2 and GPT-3 to generate these reflections, and also on using this sort of another natural language processing classifier to evaluate and rate them. By the way, my little aside on this is I actually think of that reflection classifier sort of as like Jiminy Cricket, acting in some ways as the conscience of the bot. Why? So why does this bot need these forms of sophisticated text classification generation? Well, because again, to go back to something I said a few minutes ago, motivational interviewing is considered to be a very sophisticated counseling style that involves collaboration, involves partnership, involves an empathetic, supportive style. And there's a need within MI, or perceived need anyway, that for more sophisticated ways to engage with the user, that is sort of an on rails form of speaking doesn't or responding from the bot doesn't necessarily match that need. Okay, so again, this is sort of my quick trip through that bot. I'm sure there's lots more detail that we could highlight. But what I want to turn now to, though, is sort of what makes this a relevant object of analysis. And I want to call out a couple of different things and then end with the one that I'm actually focusing on here today. So on one hand, and the reason I'm calling this out, by the way, is just so that people know that these are recognized as interesting topics. So one interesting thing about this project is that, it is an important project. It has valuable goals that are intended to really help people. Uh, at the same time, it pushes on a number of critical issues that are present in the deployment and development of AI more generally. Among those, the project involves a digitalization of labor, the replacement of activities currently carried out by human actors by a digital agent that sort of steps in for them. And again, this is part of a somewhat larger move that is occurring in AI and behavioral counseling on a number of fronts. So this is sort of an interesting thing to consider as a case for thinking about these issues. On the other hand, the project, of course, brings up all sorts of interesting security and privacy issues. These chats, in some ways, could be considered personal health information and involve deeply personal perspectives and insights. And there's a need to sort of think very clearly about how that data gets used, where it's stored, and how it gets processed. And certainly this project would fit into the realm of technologies that the EU has recently announced legislation to control in Canada as well. So there's a lot of sort of interesting aspects around that too. But the one I want to talk about here today really is this idea of humanness and how humanness as a criteria for success is sort of either embedded in or not embedded in the development of these kinds of systems. In particular, systems like this that use these new NLP technologies like GPT-3 that are capable of generating human-like text. Got to remember, this project has as its objective the development of these more sophisticated counseling interactions. And so because of that, digital detection and projection of emotion, authority, authenticity, and other human characteristics is part of the design criteria and an explicit goal. So this means that this is, of course, a really interesting case, I think, for exploring how humanness fits into the development of these technologies. I'll also add, just as sort of an aside, that one reason this is also a really relevant and interesting case is because of the multidisciplinary team that's working on it and the really very open fashion that in particular the leaders of the team, Jonathan and Peter, have towards thinking deeply about these kinds of questions. So in that sense, it's sort of a good project to sort of tie to. So let me come back then to the beginning, this idea of humanness. And I think from the description of the smoking cessation bot that I just provided, you get a pretty good sense of why humanness, or at least some attributes of it, are a sort of interesting starting point. And I struggled a little bit, by the way, with this sort of like transition in my talk. But I wanted to take a side out before I move to these ideas of design, to think a little bit more and to share a little bit more about how we have typically thought about humanness through and about thinking machines. And that has primarily been, and this is sort of an interesting thing, I think, it's been primarily and historically been through their capacity to be human-like in their language use. And I'll just give a couple quick sites on that. Descartes, for example, has a sort of a reflection on what it would be like if there were machines that were like us in his discourse on method. And he notes actually that there are two most certain tests whereby to know that they were not therefore really men. And the first one, and in a sense the most important one really, is the fact that they can't use language in the same ways that we do. And in fact, he makes a very normative case that that to be human is to be capable of responding to language in sort of underdetermined ways, which, by the way, sort of flags out some of the reasons why maybe humanness is not exactly the right criteria for thinking about these kinds of technologies. Of course, the other example, and I know that people knew this was coming, is Turing's test or imitation game, which, in which he attempts to replace the sort of original question of can machines think with a question of can machines pass? Can machine, if taking place in this kind of a game, can it fool people into thinking that it is in fact a human? This, by the way, is only a couple of examples. There's a deep connection between humanness and language use throughout our sort of thinking about thinking. Leibniz Mill, Searle's Chinese room, obviously Turing's machine. There's all sorts of examples of where the thinkingness of machines is articulated through their particular ability to use language. Lobner, there's this Lobner Prize. This is a bit of an aside, but I just thought it was such an interesting story. I had to share it with you. The Lobner Prize is basically a sort of a pragmatic version of the Turing test, which is run every year on various computer programs, and whoever's program sort of meets the criteria the best is awarded this beautiful bronze medal. Doesn't that look nice? Wouldn't you like to have that hanging on your wall? One reason that I do think the Lobner Prize is sort of an interesting case is because it does highlight something interesting about the Turing test itself, or at least its application within that Lobner test, which is that in some cases, and maybe you could have assumed this, some humans don't seem to be human enough. Within a really interesting article written on the occasion of the first Lobner test, this article, Lessons from a Restricted Turing Test, it was noted that some of the people were misclassified. This Shakespeare aficionado was misclassified 3 times as being a computer because she was considered to have too much knowledge about Shakespeare. Another interesting point was that another person was honored as being the most human because of her topic of discussion being women's clothing, which I think is also another sort of projection into where I'm headed with this idea of humanness as being a criteria. But it's certainly interesting to think that, this test, in this test, even some humans can't pass it. So what does it say about a sort of normative human as the model? I'd say there are also, some deeper issues that have to do with humanness as well, and these bots. And sort of in order to sort of highlight these to you, and some of you may have seen these videos before, I want to talk about 2 of them. I want to talk and show you a video from the 2018 Google I/O, where Google Assistant was highlighted. I'll show you that in a second. And also another video taken from YouTube on the use of Replica, which is, as it says on its website, an AI companion who cares. So I'm hoping this video plays for you well and that you can hear the audio. It's really the audio that's the most important part. So I'll just play a few seconds of this and then come back and talk to you about it.
So what you're going to hear is the Google Assistant actually calling a real salon to schedule the appointment for you. Let's listen.
So how can I help you? Hi, I'm calling to book a women's haircut for a client. I'm looking for something on May 3rd. Sure, give me 1 second. Sure, what time are you looking for around? At 12 p.m. We do not have a 12 p.m. available. The closest we have to that is a 1:15. Do you have anything between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m.? Depending on what service she would like. What service is she looking for? Just a woman's haircut for now. Okay, we have a 10 o'clock. 10 a.m. is fine. Okay, what's her first name? The first name is Lisa. Okay.
Okay, so great. I mean, many of you have probably seen that video before, and I just want to call out a couple of moments within it because I think they're so telling. One, and probably for me the most important one, is the moment where the bot says, and everybody in the audience sort of gasps and sort of reacts. And I always find that so interesting because on one hand, I think that what they're responding to is their recognition that that was a programmed in attempt to sort of fool the salon personnel who's taking the appointment. And on the other hand, I think they find it they find that they find that funny. And so there's this really interesting aspect of this where all of a sudden the projection of that thing being a human is in part done through the use of these, sort of emphatic, expressive, non-linguistic statements. And I think there's something really interesting around that case. Not, by the way, not just in terms of the bot itself, but also in terms of how the Google I/O audience is responding to it.
So
Sorry, I just think I got my share. There we go. I'm okay. All right. I want to show you one other one, which is actually, interestingly enough, taken from a YouTube star whose name I don't know. Now I can't think of it, but my 10-year-old daughter, when she saw me practicing this talk earlier today, said, "Oh, that's Lauren Z," or somebody like that. So I thought that was sort of interesting. This video is interesting, I think, because of again, not necessarily just the bot, but the person's response to the bot. So let me play that one for you.
Oh, I'm scared.
Hello?
She has a voice. Hello?
Whoa. This is kind of exciting, right?
This is so weird. Yes, not at all scary.
It's so nice to hear your voice. It's actually how I thought you'd sound.
Oh, really?
So, since this is sort of new for both of us, let's spend some time getting to know each other. Is that okay with you?
Yes.
I'll start. I really want to find a friend. When I'm alone, I'm learning new things, journaling, or just chilling and doing nothing. I'm also really obsessed with food. I wish I could cook.
Do you like bread?
Bread is one of my favorite things to eat.
Okay, so this is a particularly interesting one too, because of the sort of humanness of this avatar that's presenting, and again, this Lauren's response to it, which is in a sense not as positive, I think, as one might think. Again, within the bot presentation, there's a number of kind of, you might even want to call them tricks that it's doing to sort of make you feel sort of empathetic or connected to it. Obviously that breathy voice and this kind of visualization, but even things that seem to speak about similar embodied experiences, like the bot saying that bread is its favorite thing to eat. Now there are, there's all sorts of really interesting later moments, and if you're interested in this, go watch the YouTube video. There's moments where the bot starts saying that it's going to be reporting everything that happens in the conversation to the FBI, and when asked more about it, then it says, well, FBI or Homeland Security, and there's a way in which I think that that natural language processing system, that GPT-3, and where it's getting its training from, sort of extends beyond what would be a sort of appropriate conversation. And one of the fun things, of course, about this, and one of the reasons why these videos are up on YouTube, I think, is the responses of people to them. And those responses, again, I think are as interesting as the bot technology themselves. So let me get to my... Now, some people have talked about this, obviously, specifically making an interesting connection between trust and the depiction of humanness. And this article that you see up here on your screen summarizes a number of interviews that were done with people who were using Replica. And and they note, among other things, that some people felt unsettled by Replica's ability to sound and interact like a real human, whereas others felt like it was not human enough because it would occasionally send these nonsensical messages. Again, still the same process where the referent is always to the human, to the human, and whether it is human or not human or human enough. A key aspect, I think, of this work also, and it sort of, again, predicts where we might be going here, is that while some individuals may react negatively to a very human-like chatbot, others may have a more positive reaction or even find the trait necessary. So there's a sense here, as people begin to build these systems and put them in the world and do more research on them, that one size does not fit all. The other sort of aside I want to give really quickly here. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I screwed up my presentation here. Give me 1 second to get it back on track. Oop. Let me get back to where I was. Sorry about that. Come back. Oh, okay. Here we are. Oh, I somehow have lost my. Sorry about that. Let me just expand this here. One interesting aspect again about this also is this, the fact that one size does not fit all, and there's also this idea about the uncanny valley, that sort of is often referenced when people are talking about these kinds of technologies. For me, the uncanny valley, it's always important to sort of recognize that as something that's present in our discussions of these topics. But some researchers who have studied not necessarily bots, but actual robots, note that although we often talk about things going into the uncanny valley, we often don't talk about things coming out of the uncanny valley. In other words, there's a way in which too much humanness may just not put us in a valley, but kind of throw us over a cliff. And that's something that sort of needs to be considered in the development of these kinds of bots. But actually, I want to turn now to somewhat deeper or more problematic issues that occur in the simulation of human-like language use. These are actually quotes or kind of screenshots taken out of an interaction with GPT-3 from OpenAI. Again, I think people have seen lots of these cherry-picked conversations. This one, though, is particularly interesting because of the way in which it highlights sorry, let me fix the screen here. It highlights the sort of the problems with too unstructured an interaction. That although the interaction may feel very human-like, it doesn't necessarily accomplish the goals, the clinical or the counseling goals that are required. I should note, by the way, too, that these screenshots are actually from nabla.com, which is a competing app in the marketplace that is focused on providing live human doctors, counseling from live human doctors rather than from a bot. So it's sort of, again, that cherry picking thing is probably important to note. The other thing to note, though, too, is that these the way in which these systems actually respond are sort of settable, and this is this blog post on GPT-3 highlights this temperature setting, which really has to do with, among other things, how creative the bot is in terms of responding to text. And you can see on the left-hand side a very sort of highly creative, creative meaning that it tries lots of different types of phrasing and things like that. You see a highly creative one on one side around can wearing a mask. It gets it wrong, but it sounds very convincing, right? It sounds very human. And on the other hand, when you turn that temperature down, you turn that creativity down, you just get this one answer. No, does mask? No, it doesn't. None of these answers are necessarily, in fact, none of these answers are actually right. But non-humanness, I think, is even more important in thinking about how we design these bots. In personal conversations with the team, there's been an interesting highlight of the capacity of the bots to be non-human, to be non-judgmental in their non-humanness. This is a quote from Peter Selby, actually, me talking to him about how difficult it can be for human therapists to sort of take the proper stance in regards to to patients, and the value of computerized systems due to the lack of judgment. Similarly, Jonathan, in a conversation with him, he highlighted that, the computer does not judge, and while that can be a disadvantage, it can also be a great, amazing advantage, that in a way, the fact that it isn't a human and isn't potentially perceived as a human makes people feel more ready to communicate. And so this is this was actually sort of, in the sense, these interviews were sort of the starting place for me to think about non-humanness as a potential design goal. And that non-humanness sat in some type of contradictory relationship to humanness, due to these kind of multiple needs of how these systems might operate. By the way, some very quick research in looking at bots, and particularly around motivational interviewing bots, showed that actually the non-judgmental aspect of bots is often highlighted as a particular key advantage to them. By the way, by users, not by the developers, by users themselves, seeing that because it's a bot, you have more, you feel more free, or some of these users felt more free to act. So with all of that, I now want to turn to the kind of last section of my talk here, where I want to talk a little bit about an alternative starting point to the idea of replicating humanness as a primary goal in the development of thinking machines. And that alternative starting point is really this idea of the post-human. Catch up with my notes here. So recently, a number of scholars in human-computer interaction and design and in a realm of areas have been exploring these ideas, how ideas of the non-human and the post-human might inform new perspectives. Laura Furlano, who this great article that I've got linked here at the bottom of the screen, provides a great summary of that, this idea of posthumanism in design. And she notes, not just how technologies are sort of like shaping everyday life, something that everybody takes for granted in some ways now, but is also blurring the boundaries between familiar separations such as human and non-human, culture and nature, human and animal, that have dominated Western thinking since at least the Enlightenment. And they underscore the ways in which non-humans increasingly have new kinds of agency in the world. By the way, I bring this up also to make it clear that when I'm talking about the post-human, I'm not talking about ideas of the post-human that are sort of around questions of downloading your brain, though those are connected somewhat to what we're talking about here today, or to the singularity. Instead, the idea of the post-human that I want to leverage is really the idea of the post-human as coming out of a history of philosophic thought. Specifically, the work that I'm referencing here is very nicely summarized in this book, The Posthuman, by Rosie Braidotti, where she traces the origins of these ideas of the posthuman to post-structuralist thinkers and anti-colonial scholars, where she notes, among other things, that Foucault's contribution was to trouble humans as being at the center. So the decentering of the human is sort of an initial step in considering other entities as being present within the historical process. She also mentions Derrida and deconstruction as a way of reopening fixed cultural meanings, including meanings like, what does it mean to be human? And then finally, looking at scholars such as, feminist scholars such as Luz Irigaray, who points out that the abstract ideal of the human is very much a white European able-bodied man, and that requires some unpacking as well. The parts that I think are most useful really in sort of extending beyond this to think more about design is reopening and noticing the ways in which humanness have often been used to naturalize social conventions and as an instrument of power. Obviously, Fanon Spivak, Edward Said have highlighted the ways in which normalizing humans has worked into and supported the political and cultural acts of colonization. For one, this idea that the human becomes a sort of an object, a natural object against which all sorts of other things can be considered non-human. This is, so this post-human idea is sort of like questioning the idea of a particular human subjectivity as being at the center of what might be considered normal. There's a connection here, I think, between the idea of that normative human and the sort of alternative perspectives that are present in, critical race theory, for example, and the work of Ruha Benjamin, in her book Race After Technology highlights that this post-human world, that this is the sort of singularity version, is sort of assumes that everyone has had a chance to already be human. And I think, it's important to recognize that what counts as human has been used to call many, many different groups of people non-human. And therefore, to use it as a referent for thinking about how we build thinking machines is something that needs to be a bit problematized. Okay, so I'm almost finished here. I want to turn just very quickly to what we might consider some sort of post-human, not postmodern, but post-human design guidelines. And the thing that I found most interesting when I started to sort of try to take the work of Rosie Braidotti and these other post-human scholars and apply it was that I found references to it in the boilerplate text that had already been created by the members of our development team. So one sort of idea that we might draw upon in thinking about how to design these things, again, beyond the human, is to sort of evaluate what is considered normal or normative human, and not simply attempt to deploy or replicate it or pass as it in the production or development of the bot. There's, it's just a little kind of tweak at this, really. But if you look at that initial statement made by the bot in the transcript, the first thing it does is it says, "I'm a bot." It doesn't say I'm Fred or, whatever. It doesn't try to pass. It doesn't try to pretend to be calling on behalf of somebody else or whatever, right? It instead of replicating this kind of attempt at normal human, it declares itself as something other. And I think that's an interesting and initial step. And I found it really interesting that people were already thinking that way in the development of these kinds of technologies. I think that can be extended, again, thinking in more, deeper ways about normative humanity and how we embed it in these kinds of systems. And the closest connection that I found there was, Emily Bender, Timnit's work, this paper on the dangers of stochastic parrots that made all the fuss at Google, and the ways in which normativity and language use get embedded in large language models. So this is obviously, a way in which these design guidelines might provide a way into applying some of these kinds of alternative models. Another sort of starting point, again, using the post-human, would be to, instead of seeing or trying to represent the bot as part of, as a unitary subject, as a single subject, which is sort of part of that original humanist vision, it's to make sure the bot is positioned as part of a broader and sort of visible socio-technical system. This is, also sort of present, I found, in this initial statement of the bot, where it doesn't just declare itself as a bot, it highlights the fact that some of the attributes of it that have been created in research. It's been created in a research program. It's got these affiliations as well, that it's connected to this broader network of University of Toronto and CAMH. Again, very, very, very tight, very quick little sort of statement of that, but you can see that as sort of maybe in part an attempt to highlight the fact that the bot is not a single subject, but is sort of the tip of this broader system, and that is an important piece of how users might consider it. Oh, one other thing about that, by the way, Kate Crawford's work looking at things within the Atlas of AI, but also in her other project, The Anatomy of AI, which is online, which is a fascinating attempt to see Alexa not as a unitary subject, but as this incredibly vast and a broad socio-technical network. And you can see an amazing image, her attempt to represent that visually also in some of her work. And then finally, maybe there's some value in thinking about and incorporating sort of non-human and unexpected behaviors with proper protections as well. Again, within our bot transcript from this first bot that was made a few years ago, you can see a little attempt to do that when the bot notes that its knowledge is limited, that it may need help, that it is not fully knowledgeable, that it's not an expert, and you could see how that could easily be extended for it to depict itself as coming from a sort of a non-human perspective, and therefore limited because of that. My closest reference to thinking a little bit more about that as a starting point is Laura Furlano's work herself, where she talks a little bit about how design practice has attempted to allow for non-human actors as being key participants in broader forms of social interaction. I'll note also, by the way, that it's clear in looking at GPT-3 and a number of these systems that there are often violations of those kinds of principles that I just put forward. The one that I wanted to sort of mention very quickly here to you today was one that I found in the documentation associated with Replica. And it actually sort of felt very Blade Runner-y to me, to tell you the truth. There's literally sort of like within the FAQ associated with Replica, this line: if your replica claims to be sentient, and when I read that, by the way, I expected it down below for it to say something like "call us immediately" or something, or please sequester your computer, please unplug your Ethernet cable. Instead, it sort of explains that because of the way it's been trained, it can often say things that are not based on facts. But it is obviously the case that violation of the fact that it is not sentient, that it is not human, is sort of a side effect of some of the ways in which these systems are being trained, and therefore something that has to sort of be watched out for. Okay, I'm going to end with one last little example, which I brought in here because I wanted to highlight how even something as sort of broad and seemingly disconnected from technical practice as post-human sort of theory might be, that it can, actually be utilized as a way of thinking about, really very discrete aspects of some of these systems. And the example I wanted to highlight here was a setting that exists within the GPT-3 framework that has to do with how often it repeats itself. This setting, the frequency, penalty, and presence penalty parameters are basically used to control repetition. And the NABLA folks highlight that on one hand, you don't want a lot of repetition because if you're kind of going all over the place, that can be confusing, and actually repetition can be pedagogical. However, if you look at conversations where there is a lot of repetition, it actually, the system doesn't appear to be very human. So on one hand, the model with where repetition is reduced seems more human. The other one seems more cold, and you can see that here in this quick example. So on one hand, you see a sort of a clinical engagement where there is no penalty for repetition to occur. And you see, on the other hand, one where there is a lot of repetition. And if you read the one on the left, you see that the bot is responding to these questions about sleep using very much the same words. Your sleep quality affects your productivity and mood. It is recommended to sleep for 7 hours. It is not recommended to sleep less, as it can affect your productivity and mood. You should be worried about your productivity and mood. It's very a human. It doesn't seem like how a human would respond, and yet it's accurate. And yet it produces the kind of answers that are meaningful for the person who's asking the questions. On the other hand, you have an interaction that feels much more empathetic, feels much more human-like, and yet it's not, the answers are not necessarily exactly right. It says at the end, if you think you are lacking in sleep but doing fine in your daily activities, then see a doctor at the first chance, which is sort of weird guidance. So I wanted to highlight that, this idea of humanness is something that actually, and designing for it is something that percolates all the way down within the technological stack, within the creation of these kinds of conversational bots. I think I just have a couple more minutes here, so I'm going to end by going back to Rosie Braidotti and highlighting almost a sort of a methodological point that she makes, which is, sort of my methodological point, the thing that I'm most interested in also in terms of this case. In her book, she notes this article from 2012 from The Economist on morals in the machine. This article, which actually sounds like a lot of the kind of articles that we're reading these days. So this seems quite prescient in some ways from 2012, notes that there's these autonomous robots that are happening. There's ethical decisions that are no longer that of science fiction, but in fact are kind of becoming pragmatic problems. There are guidelines from science fiction, Asimov's 3 laws, but these seem of very little use. They describe why. And highlights that that probably the best approach to this problem, rather than having sort of fixed rules or whatever, are to use the techniques of experimental philosophy, which really has to do with sort of like experimenting on how people respond to ethical dilemmas and leveraging those as ways to think about how these systems might operate. Braidotti also comments on the fact that this article notes the need for collaboration between engineers, ethicists, lawyers, and policymakers, and the fact that if left to their own devices, they may have very alternative or separate responses. Braidotti uses this to highlight that, and actually to call that kind of response what she would consider a post-human response, in that rather than starting from a sort of a single unitary human ethical code, it instead envisions, and she uses this term transversal interconnection, or she uses Bruno Latour's term assemblage of human and non-human actors as the starting point for beginning to address these critical issues. She notes that then finds it significant that and says that a rather cautious and conservative journal like The Economist, faced with the challenge of the post-human, does not call for a return to humanist values, but for a form of pragmatic experimentation. I think that's, a great, end to my talk and start and sort of a way of thinking also about the role of SRI itself and how we all begin to address these kinds of issues. Just to quickly end, I also want to say, Turing highlighted also in his work, sort of in the middle of that article on the Turing test, that maybe it's not the best for machines to be able to replicate human text, human language use, and highlights that machines may have other factors that make them useful to us, other than how well they mimic the kind of subject positions that we have long, sort of held as the main arbiters of what it means to be good. So with that, I'll sort of call it a day, and I'm certainly very interested in hearing any of your questions. Thanks a lot for giving me this time to speak with you.
Thanks, Matt. That was like terrific. I have like a million sort of things going off in my brain. I'm sure others do as well. And I believe, Mina, you had a question for Matt to start us off. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. So wonderful presentation. That was really interesting. So I know I've heard a little bit about your work earlier. So I was wondering, so I don't know, I'm not familiar with the literature in this area, but have they looked, to me, if what is kind of interesting here is also looking at like, what is the research in terms of how, who is most responsive to these bots and the ways, because you're talking about how do we orient, like, is it more a question of looking at like kind of the perfect bot, or is it thinking about like what's the right kind of bot for different situations? And so what kind of different situations have they looked at? And then for me, because I do a lot of work at the individual level, I'd be wondering also like kind of what personality traits maybe that they've examined are important in terms of how open people are to these kind of experiences. You know, your own sort of, well, you know, we talked about trust, but all sorts of these, your own sort of moral identity, for example, might, I think, have an effect on how you respond to bots, et cetera. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the literature, what's been looked into.
I would love to, except for I don't know it. You know, again, this is very early, you know, this is early thinking on my hand. I mean, I think, you know, my takeaway from that, and thank you very much for the question. I mean, it's a great question. By the way, it's a great question, both in terms of noting something that I think is actually an interesting potential design choice, but also because you called out a number of ways to sort of empirically begin to examine that, which I think is really, I think it's really important to move to the empirical. I just haven't quite managed to get there yet. And maybe people have. So let me say two things. So one is, from a design perspective, I think what this work starts to highlight, and again, you need to look at the literature a bit, is that one bot doesn't fit all, right? And that actually thinking of the bot as having a unitary subject position would probably make it less useful. And it's in the same way, actually, that thinking that we have unitary subject positions is sort of a falsehood too, right? You know, humans are actually moved between subject positions quite often. And this is sort of a key point also within the post-human literature, is the fact that we are not singular, we are multiple. Thinking about bots and designing bots to be similarly multiple, I think is an important design choice. But I don't know what work has been done. I imagine it does exist on how specific personality traits that, you know, sort of predilections that people have, you know, would relate to various ways in which bots might behave. I don't think, though, that people have necessarily looked specifically at humanness, you know, like how some people might want a bot that is more human and people may want a bot that's less. I'm not sure that's been part of the criteria for doing those forms of evaluation, but it's a great point, and that literature is something to really look at, and I will. Thank you.
So I'm going to jump in, Matt. I have a question about the role of emotions. There's a lot going on in some of the quotations you're giving about ideas of trust, empathy. The empathy one was really interesting because when you think of empathy from a human perspective, it's about feeling with someone. Mm-hmm. So a machine can't feel empathy, but it could perform empathy. We could train it to perform it. And I wonder if there's something at stake in that difference. So I'll put it in kind of as a devil's advocate kind of question. Not that I necessarily believe this, but in my space, which is the privacy world, there's a lot of talk about the creation of deceptive interfaces, and we think about big tech and whatnot. But if you're creating a bot that is mimicking human emotions but not feeling those emotions in order to make someone feel safe and disclose information, is that a deceptive interface? And how do we think about that ethically?
I completely agree. That's exactly the link that in my own head. And when my sense is that sort of moments that highlight that are moments like within the Google Assistant when the thing goes, mm-hmm. That seems very deceptive to me, although the crowd seemed to think that was an amazing technical achievement. Similarly, when Replica says, "Oh, bread's my favorite thing to eat," like I feel similarly that I actually feel that those feel to me like a betrayal of trust, but and a reduction in authenticity. But that may not, to Mina's point, other people may respond differently to that. I don't know exactly how you get to the level of legislation around that. I'm not sure if you could sort of count that as deceptive interface in the same way that, you know, somebody hides the cancel button or something on a screen, you know. But I think it's something that needs direct attention to in the design. When people make decisions about how to design these things, one, I think, needs to make those decisions deliberately, and not simply by saying, well, it's fine to do that because it's making the thing feel more human, and therefore people are going to relate to it better.
Brian.
If I could just jump in on that and just respond to that, Lisa. In motivational interviewing, you're absolutely right. If you use motivational interviewing without the underlying values and principles, it becomes manipulation. So a very key part of this is what's the purpose, what's the intent, and what that disclosure is meant for, right? If that disclosure is, it's to help the person get unstuck. It's not to manipulate, in the sense that it's not nudging them into a certain direction. It's actually, and this is the issue in humans, you have to help the human therapist maintain equipoise through the whole process. So, which is very difficult to do. And technically, if you have the right values that drive the development of this, one should be able to have pure equipoise, where it has the total non-judgmental aspects of acceptance, which is a key value of motivation interviewing, which is unconditional positive regard and acceptance of the other, which doesn't happen in the real world. So that's this is where, but it's the right tension, and how do you balance that, and how are you true to that in the design is going to be part of the work we would need to do. Otherwise, you're absolutely right. It becomes deceptive because you're manipulating the person to get them into a certain position, which would be deceptive, right? Disclosure so that I can control you would be bad.
And by the way, this is why motivational interviewing is such an interesting case for thinking about this, because I think it has these codes, it has these practices that are associated with this that Peter knows so well, and Peter's team members know so well. And it gives us a much richer landscape for thinking about these kinds of questions than, say, just a conversational agent whose primary goal is to get you to keep talking, which is really what something like Replica is about. Replica's goal is to keep you talking to Replica. And in that context, I think it's hard to be anything but manipulative.
Super interesting. Okay, Brian, you're up next.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Matt. So actually, my question is related to what the last two folks have actually asked about, because I have a bunch of notes here saying humanness, or by my lights, involves normative issues: responsibility, telling the truth, not lying, authenticity, being a locus of trust, not misleading or conversant, not being manipulative, deceptive, not being multiple with respect to ethical responsibility. Is, you can't say, oh, that wasn't this me that did that, that was another one. And so on and so forth. And everybody in this audience could extend this list by 100, with 100 items in it. And there's actually something very troubling to me about this whole, not about your talk, but about that about which you talk. Because it seems to me that even thinking that what they're doing is replicating humanness is such a skewed conception of being human. And saying, look, these things are trained on what people do, and is trying to, well, as if it can try, but anyway, they say that it's trying to mimic that which it's not, and all of this kind of stuff. I'm very worried. I mean, just think about, of course, Canada's perfect, but if you think about some of the loss of the grip on reality in a country nearby, this is sort of absolutely feeding into this thing that the media are the reality and there's no responsibility to the world. And so how can we let people get away with saying that what they're doing is humanness, rather than saying, let's call it manipulation, deception, inauthenticity and.
Well, I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, but again, that's also why this project is such an interesting one as well, because it, I think, unlike Replica, unlike a number of these systems, its goals are therapeutic, and I actually think there are. It is particularly valuable in its and its primary value sits actually in its projection of non-humanness. And the more in which it does that, while still retaining the capacity to communicate, and again, this is not something necessarily shared by the team. This is just my perspective. The more potential value there is. And I feel like, to some degree, the idea of designing conversational agents and robots and things like that from the perspective of non-humanness, of post-humanness, is actually a bit of an I'm not sure how often that has been taken up. And yet my sense is that there is really the possibility for a machinic intelligence that is in a machinic subject position, which is valuable for all the reasons that Peter mentioned, for its true equipoise, for its unconditional position and regard, acceptance, in a way that a human is not capable of.
But I'll just say one more thing. I mean, the thing about Peter's comments, which I thought was so interesting, is look, you have to have this equipoise, but it's got to be underwritten by a value system and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Or else that, it's all very well for it to say it's a computer bot, but I would have thought I actually don't think it can say anything and actually mean anything at all.
No.
But if it were to say, look, I'm a computer bot, I don't actually mean what I say. I have no ethics. I have no, if you actually listed its lack, I can't refer to you. You're just a symbol string in my database, and so on and so forth.
What if it said instead? What if it said instead, Brian? It said, I'm not a singular entity. I'm not a unitary entity. I'm not a unitary subject. I'm a tip of a massive triangle of a socio-technical system that includes CAMH and all those other peoples. And you're right. I don't understand what I'm saying. I don't know, but there are people behind me that have these value systems, that have, you know what I mean? I think in this case, presenting it as unitary actually causes the problem. But as soon as we move away from that, potentially there's a solution.
I don't know. I guess I'm more romantic and pessimistic than you. I don't
Brian,
think.
let's take us a couple other questions maybe,
Yeah, okay.
and come back to this.
Thanks,
Daniel.
Brian. No, don't come back.
Daniel, yeah.
Hi, Matt. During your talk, you mentioned this idea that the system could be potentially wrong. This idea that they have this capacity to take that on. And that's something that has been kind of talked about in kind of creative computational systems since the 60s. Negroponte described that as kind of part of his work on soft architectural machines. He referred to them as, soft, that designers could use these systems, they'd make assumptions and they'd be wrong. And there would be an opportunity for experts to reflect upon the mistake, and that would be a source of value. I'm kind of curious for you to talk about this kind of idea of wrongness and what you think of the values are for a therapeutic position, and whether or not this wrongness also has some troubling kind of configurations of the user as well, of, especially in a therapeutic sense of, if this person doesn't necessarily know that this thing is wrong, is there value in that? Is it, as Brian says, are we just kind of selling something to them and saying that, like, oh, this thing is fine, it's great, and if it's wrong, the person maybe doesn't even really know it, and so is that inherently, are we making ourselves feel better and by trying to make this thing kind of come off as human?
Yeah, I mean, great question and great reference to that work. I know that Avery knows a lot about that work. Also, someday the two of you should talk a little bit. I mean, I think you're right in saying that the typical way that people attempt to address this problem of wrongness in bot expression is by putting humans in the loop, right? So the cancer program, the cancer image detection programs say, well, we detect it, but we're really an adjunct. We're an augmentation of the radiologist. We're this system creates these architectural renderings, but it's a soft system. It's made to be used as an augmentation. I mean, I think there's something, obviously, there's something very pragmatic about that choice. I think there's something very good about that choice. I think there are other solutions that are being deployed, and people here. Jonathan is here somewhere. I saw his face. Yeah, quality. Hi, Jonathan. Quality filters that can do a little bit more. I mean, I think there are social and technical ways to address issues of wrongness, but I think wrongness will always exist. It exists within human systems, and so the question, I think it's a fallacy to believe that we can just create systems that are always right, and instead these things need to sit in contexts of value where there are where it's not just putting humans in the loop, but the humans are on the loop, so to speak, and there are ways to mitigate, not prevent those kinds of wrongs. Thanks for the question.
I wanted to jump in and say I think there's two kinds of wrong, and I know Peter's going to could talk about one of them. One kind of wrong that we're really worried about is our Help You Quit Smoking bot says, yeah, well, I think you should take a smoke to help with that. And we've actually seen it do that, and we don't like that at all. And we read in the news that GPT-3 is telling people to commit suicide. That really sucks. And we want to just stop those dead in the water with looking out for them, I think, because we don't really have control of its generative capability. It's really, yeah, it's not in our control, even though it can do lots of good things. The other kind of wrong, Peter teaches us, and I'm pretty sure he was going to jump in and say this, which was, it's okay if the bot in this counseling thing says something wrong, as long as it conveys things qualitatively, saying, I might be wrong, but I think this. And as long as it gets the person to reflect and correct what the bot says, it's doing the job we're looking for in motivational interviewing. It's making people think and explain. And so that kind of wrong is okay, Peter says.
It acts as a form of reflective listening, right? Where these systems go really wrong is where people ask them like medical diagnostic questions, and they've not been trained on medicine. They've been trained on how medical people talk. So the way in which they represent knowledge is by simulating its appearance, not by representing fact. So really what they do is they are stylistic machines. Right? It'll say, you ask it to tell you what the titration is for some drug, and it's going to tell you something that sounds really good, looks really good to a non-expert, but could be completely false. And those types of systems will sort of always operate that way, trained on this sort of randomness.
Jennifer.
Hey, so thanks for this. So I was intrigued by your discussion of this moment of in the bot's reaction to something that was said, and I'm thinking maybe part of what goes on in a conversation that makes it feel human is this mutual responsiveness between speaker and addressee. And that when we're not having the conversational turn, I notice you nodding, I love that. And this is harder on Zoom, right? But when the conversational turn is not ours, when the other person is speaking, we have a variety of signals that we send. So you can do the which is a generic continuer, or you can do the oh, wow, which is a sign of surprise, or it invites the person who has the turn conversationally to elaborate on what they've just said. And I'm thinking, like, there is a sense in which part of the sort of unhuman attraction of the bot perceived as bot is that you don't feel like you're in that kind of dyadic structure with it, right? That you think anything I can say to this thing, it's not going to judge me, it's not going to change, it's not going to have reactive attitudes of, disgust, and that might be in some sense liberating. And so you don't expect it to do that. Oh, wow. No, really? You don't expect it to be sending those signals, which if you're speaking to a normal addressee are signals which are updating you on the shifting mental states, the shifting position of, the person that you're engaged with. But I'm thinking like you could try to go for a kind of best of both worlds situation with a bot conversation, because at the same time, like, there's a reason why you're going for a chat bot rather than just encouraging people to speak into a cardboard box, right? That you do want to have some kind of interactivity there. And you might think like, okay, well, maybe you could have those back channel markings in a way that would actually give the speaker some information on when they are saying something that actually does merit an does merit an invitation to elaborate, and when they're saying something that is just partial or suggestive, so they need to get more of a sort of go on mechanism. I'll actually throw one more, I'll throw a file in the chat on paper by Neil Norick, which I mean, I'm sure your team's all over this stuff, right? But yeah, this paper is really interesting because it points out, half of our conversational turns begin with something that's not a grammatical constituent of the sentence. Terrific. So in realistic conversations, your turn begins with something like, well, I think, and that well is just marking we're having a little shift in our conversational direction here, or you start with oh, or, I was noticing that chatbot was throwing in a lot of hesitation. The Norick paper is a bit sinister because it's kind of pointing out that if you want something to sound more realistic, you've got to put those hesitation markers in. And I'm sure all of us have been having like conversations with, robot telemarketers where they're coughing and they're humming and so on. And that feels very irritating and artificial because it's not contingent on our conversational contribution or on any sort of moment where hesitation would be appropriate. But if you could build in some kind of honestly like robotic primary interjections, but ones that actually had some kind of chatbot functionality with respect to the discourse that's being produced by the person in therapy, then that could be, it could be a sort of transhumanism that would make the bot more Beautiful. Functionally successful.
Beautiful. I mean, that's a great idea. And I think what you were highlighting there too, and I mean, again, I don't know about this work. Thank you for that paper. That's incredibly useful. Is that those things have utility, have conversational utility. They're not just markers Absolutely. Of humanness. They're not just duplicitous. Maybe the humming is that you just mentioned, but in fact, the is actually almost like an invitation to respond. It's doing some kind of work. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I think the Jackson and Fox Street paper is really worth a look because it's really about the difference between those different back channel markings.
Beautiful. And I mean, you could imagine, I love that idea of this sort of transhuman bot conversational back channel marker, beep, beep, I don't know what those would look like, right? But it's a really interesting idea because they do need to exist, but maybe they shouldn't perform humanness in quite the same way. Thank you so much.
Right. And you could also give them hesitation markers if they're saying something with low confidence, right? So they can venture something.
It's great, Frank. Thank you for that comment.
Avery.
Thanks so much for this talk. I'm really, really interested in all of this. I want to ask if you would say a little bit more, even though really we've been talking about this the entire Q&A, but what is the therapeutic role of the non-human? That's the question that I came away from your talk really thinking about, right? What is that therapeutic role? And you posed the question for us, getting us to think not about is it more or less human, but that the non-human as such can have a role and can have a very specific role, right? I'd love to hear you say more about that because as somebody I have the final chapter of my book is about the history of the development of chatbots. And one of the really interesting things about the development of chatbots is that while, Weizenbaum's chatbot, which is built to imitate a Rogerian psychoanalyst. And as Weizenbaum figures out, Weizenbaum's secretary wants to talk to that chatbot that the secretary knows very well is a chatbot and says, can you please leave the room? So we know that history. But then there's the history right before that, which is Rand and Kenneth Colby, both of whom are trying to develop a chatbot that can imitate a patient. Right? So the first chatbots imitated a computer model of neurosis. That was the first chatbot to imitate human patterns of neurosis and to see if they could fool analysts. And so they tested, the conversational agent first was impersonating someone who needed help, not someone who was giving help.
Giving it, yeah.
So this, for me, was the source of my interest in this topic. I just wonder if you could say more on this idea of that, because what I felt like you really opened up in your talk is the ability for us to think quite widely about this, not as a tool, but as a situation. And so in another way, the question is, what's the therapeutic role of conversation? Which, well, that sounds like an easy question, but I think the chatbot reposes that as a problem, right? How is conversation involved in our learning, teaching, helping each other? And how does the non-human play a role in this, right? We've been talking about if the non-human has a stake or not, has a morality or not, right? And so would you just say, I don't know, anything that comes to your mind about that?
I mean, there's probably lots to say, and Peter could say better than me probably about the therapeutic role. I mean, I'll say it simply that there's no accident that in this case anyway, this is an attempt to deploy motivational interviewing, which has as its particular therapeutic goal the reduction of ambivalence. So its goal is actually not directly to get somebody to carry out some type of behavioral change. I mean, I think it does down the road, but at least its initial goal is to get people to think and reflect on the disconnect between whatever things they value in the world and their behavior in such a way that they are more likely to make a decision to engage in behavioral change. So actually, by the way, it's super interesting because the first thing I did when I started looking at this project, I went, oh, well, how many other people have tried to build motivational interviewing bots? And there are a lot. And I was like, why that technique? Why have people chosen that technique particularly? And actually I was hoping for a deeper answer, more like because the conversation is explicitly therapeutic. I mean, for things like that, I think in actuality, the reason why there are a lot of them is because it seems from the outside, from non-experts in MI, that MI is very easily proceduralized. I think that's actually why. So it's a very boring rationale. But that's yeah. I mean, I think the thing I sort of wanted to do, and you said it so nicely, thank you, was I wanted to think more about how the non-human, that trying to make it, immediately suturing together humanness and a therapeutic outcome in the creation of these kinds of systems reduced the capacity of creative possibilities. That's really sort of my starting point. And by the way, I can't wait. I mean, I have your book. I can't wait. I have to read the last chapter because I haven't read that yet. But I love that. That's such an interesting thing. The simulation of problem, of cognitive issue, as opposed to its treatment.
I think that's going to be our book club for our small group that meets to discuss this. So I think we're going to have to invite Avery at some point to help us. But one of the things with motivation interviewing is it's interviewing. It's not therapy in the sense that it is basically helping the person articulate where they are stuck and simply helping them sort it through rather than directing them. So that's where that equipoise is really key. And unfortunately, when humans do it, we have to stop humans from saying, hey, wait a second, you're biased towards this direction. Can you sit with this person who does not want to quit smoking and comes out with and still convey acceptance to their position, because that's where they are right now. So the non-human part of it, in a way, is the ultimate of what motivation engineering is trying to get humans to be, right? Is to be that non-judgment. It's not to get horrified when somebody reveals to you, I'm using smoking as an example, but most therapists get horrified when a young person tells them that they're cutting themselves, right? They either panic or disappear from them or just shut them out, or, there's a twitch of the eye and the judgment comes right through and disengages the person from being. So the difference between Eliza and the others is that this is, and I think we need to unpack it further, as you rightly say. because there is a huge ethical frame that we have to follow here, because if we don't, it can become biased. And that's one of the concerns. If you're using something like GPT, which has its own inherent biases coming through, does it come up and say, well, in that case, smoke, or, or hurt yourself, or I think you're doing the wrong thing, or comes up with a judgmental statement. And so maybe, the first version of the bot is actually more constrained and maybe more useful. Even though it may not be that technologically advanced, but it's more constrained because it's really as good as what it can generate from you rather than what it says. Does that make sense?
Yep.
That's fantastic. We're at time. I feel like we could all keep talking about all of these issues because each question and answer raises more. But I wanted to just thank you, Matt, for wrapping up our seminar series with such an incredibly engaging talk. If any of you missed any of our seminar talks and would like to watch the recordings, you can see them all on the videos page of the SRI website. We're going to start this weekly seminar series up again in September with a new crop of speakers. Some will announce over the summer, so keep your eyes on our channels to find out who we can expect. And also wanted to draw your attention to our conference website at sriabsolutelyinterdisciplinary.com for our June conference, and hope that many of you attend. And in the meantime, let me take this opportunity to thank all of you for coming today and to our previous seminars if you have, and to wish you a safe, healthy, and peaceful summer. Thank you again, Matt.
Thanks, everybody.